Hey guys, it's 4.2, step 3, video Not to Keep. This is another Robert Frost poem. Let me read it to you. Not to keep. They sent him back to her. The letter came saying, and she could have him. And before she could be sure there was no hidden ill under the formal writing, he was there, living. They took him back to her. They gave him back to her alive. How else? They're not known to send the dead. And not disfigured visibly. His face? His hands? She had to look, to ask. What was it, dear? And she had given all, and still she had all. They had. They, the lucky. Wasn't she glad now? Everything seemed won, and all the rest for them permissible ease. She had to ask, what was it, dear? Enough. Yet not enough. A bullet through and through, high in the breast. Nothing but what good care and medicine and rest, and you a week can cure me of to go again. The same grim giving to do over for them both. She dared no more than ask him with her eyes how it was for him for a second trial. And with his eyes, he asked her not to ask. They had given him back to her, but not to keep. So the guiding question in this, for this poem is, how does Frost use dialogue and other structural choices to make a point about creating a momentary stay from confusion? So we have that same theme that Frost is so famous for. And let's talk structure now. First of all, this is a very different poem than the last poem, isn't it? So when we looked at October, first of all, we only had one stanza. Here we have two stanzas. Stanzas are verse paragraphs. And in this poem, we have dialogue, which we didn't have in the last poem. We have dialogue in line 9, and we have dialogue in line 13, and then 14 and 15 as well. This is the end of line 13, but it is a new speaker, so it's a new stanza. And, that dialogue goes all the way to line 17. And so that's a difference. Another thing that's different about this poem is that we don't have that clear rhyme scheme. We have some rhymes in here, but they are internal rhymes. Did you catch them? Sometimes you can hear them more easily than you can spot them with your eyes. Breast in line 15 and rest in line 16. And you'll notice that they both come with a punctuation mark right afterwards, so it makes you pause, right? Because we pause at punctuation when we read poetry, and poetry is meant to be heard out loud. So then we catch that rhyme there. But the rhyming seems sort of incidental, not a key pattern in the poem. So let's tackle Scassi first to get us just on the right path here so that we know that we have a good literal understanding of the poem. So take a look at S first. S is setting. Is there a place? What is it? How is it described? And how, as a reader, does it make you feel? Are all questions that we can ask when looking at the first S in Scassi. Well, we know that she gets the letter. And so there's kind of an inferred setting here. It's not described explicitly, but because she gets a letter, we know that she's home. And then we hear that he is sent back to her from a war. Again, that's not explicit, but we hear why he's sent back to her, and it's because a bullet through and through high in the breast hit him. And so then it's a little bit clearer as far as what the setting is, that she is home and he has been away in war and now is home with her. And we hear explicitly in the second stanza that he has 1 week to rest and be cared for by her before he has to go back. The characters in this poem are kind of obvious. We have at least 3 characters because we always have a speaker, right? But we don't know a lot about the speaker in this poem. Instead, we know more about the two characters, the wife who receives the letter and the husband who has been sent back to her. So who's involved are questions we can ask here. Who is the speaker? What do we know about him? What are the speaker's attitudes? What other people are involved? We have a third person omniscient speaker. So he, she is how we tell if it's a third person, right? Using those pronouns. And omniscient means that you can get inside of the head of another character. And this speaker does that because we hear the thoughts of the woman when we hear she could have him. It makes her feel doubtful and anxious at first because she thinks there may be hidden ill or that he is really dead or at least disfigured visibly. She's happy, but she's almost has to convince herself because she's afraid that it won't last or it isn't real. After all, she'll find out, have to go back to the war. In line 10, wasn't she glad now? This is her asking her how she feels. Like, isn't she happy now? These are her internal thoughts. And that's how we know it's that omniscient narrator. The man, the husband who has returned from war without disfigurement, but he is shot and has to go back after a week with his eyes. He asked her not to ask. And so that's when we get inside of his head. We know that he is trying to get her to not ask the tough questions because it's too hard to talk about. He almost died and he's got to go back to the war. So he doesn't want to talk about it. He's very direct and understated in his response to her in lines 13 through 17. Okay, so that's what we know about the characters. A is action, what action takes place. Well, the woman gets a letter, questions it, then he was there. He arrives. She continues to question how he is and if he was visibly injured and if they can be happy now. She asks him, what was it, dear? Twice on line 19 and 13. He answers, then they communicate without speaking as they think about how it will be for him to go back to war. Okay, so setting character action, we now understand the basic literal meaning of the poem. And it's interesting in and of itself, but of course where we get to the real meat is with the S in style. What's interesting about the words and the way they're arranged and ideas? What's the idea either stated or underlying? And for this one, we really have to talk about this key feature in structure, enjambment. There's a document in Schoology called Understanding Poetry and also one called Structure and Form, which is linked in the Understanding Poetry document. And the Understanding Poetry document has some questions in the second half of the questions about structure and form. And so I want you to make sure you look at that. There's also an explanation in the link in Structure and Form of a document with the same name. And I have also separately linked it in Schoology. So it has a definition of enjambment in there, but enjambment is when a poet ends a line without punctuation mark, without any punctuation marks. Okay, so here is an example of enjambment. See if you can find other examples. The letter came saying between lines 1 and 2 is an example of enjambment. There's no punctuation mark. We have a continuation of the line into the next line without any pause. Where are the other examples of enjambment? Well, they're also here, right? So between lines 1 and 2, between lines 2 and 3, 3 and 4, 9 and 10. Those are all examples of enjambment, where the line spills into the next line without a pause. Okay? And then I've highlighted all of the, we should see in the second stanza, do we have any? Yeah, we do. In between 15 and 16, and in between 17 and 18, and in between 19 and 20. Okay. I also highlighted all of the punctuation marks because that is an important part of structure as well. And what you'll probably notice is that in this poem, instead of having all the punctuation marks at the end of the lines, ends of the lines. We have them in the middle, and that has a name too. That is called Sejura. So let me show you the handout, the structure and form handout that I was talking about earlier. Sejura and Enjambment are listed in here. Not right away. You got to scroll for a bit. But this has got all kinds of good stuff for you. Eventually you'll get to Sejura. So Sejura is a strong pause in the middle of a line. Most commonly, a Sejura is punctuation somewhere else other than at the end of a line of poetry. So we have an example here. They lie together now, period. They sleep apart. In Hamlet's famous soliloquy, to be or not to be, that is the question. So a Sejura is a pause in the middle of a line. It's kind of like the opposite of enjambment, okay? Enjambment is the continuation of a sentence or a phrase across a line break. So it's no punctuation here, okay? So we have enjambment and Sejura in not to keep, and that is an interesting aspect. So you'll want to make note of that. The lack of rhyme is something else that you could write about. And then something else really important is how the sentences are structured. So not just the fact that we have punctuation marks in the middle of lines, which creates a jolt or a lot of pausing at any rate. But we also have very short sentences, a lot of them, and a lot of question marks. And so all of these things contribute to a feeling maybe of uncertainty, maybe a little bit chaotic. We have a little more certainty, I think, in the second stanza, but it's only because the characters are refusing to talk about the terrifying prospect of him having to return to war. And so there's an underlying uncertainty there. And we do still have the Sejuras, a lot of punctuation marks, a lot of pausing. So you can maybe make some connections between the way the sentences are structured and the meaning in the poem. If you look at the short lines, the question marks, and the uncertainty that's prevalent. The one last thing I think to mention is that the characters have a sort of stoicism. They act very stoic in the poem in that they are carrying on no matter what lies ahead, and they are not spending time talking about the fears that they do have. And so it's a kind of quiet, almost, I don't know, heroic or anyway, at any rate, stoic response to this danger. Okay, so think about how the way the couple responds to the danger of him having to return to war is reflected in the structure of the lines themselves. See if you can make that connection for the Aspire to do. Good luck to you, and you're ready for the master check pretty soon here.